Humans, we live in groups, and in my book, The Nature Ternary, I go into detail about how groups operate, and nature ternary is the nature of humans, nature of groups, and the nature of reality. Now, of course, one very important part of the functioning of groups is how the joint production is divided among different group members. And um, the other important thing also is how is political power distributed, and the economic distribution and the distribution of political power are of course related. To give members the opportunities for their best possible lives, societies and communities must improve their economic system towards greater equality while not losing the benefits of incentives and accountability that a free market provides. Well, there are three improvements that can be made. And at the lowest level, then the second level, and the highest level. Okay, at the lowest level, the improvement that can be made to economic systems is redistributive taxation. So let's look at redistributive taxation. Now, the free markets have the virtues of accountability and incentives, but they can produce a large levels of inequality that are not compatible with strong communities. There's really no economic theory which tells us how steep this pyramid is going to be. Right? Like steep means like something like this. A flat pyramid is something like this. So steep pyramid is like greater inequality. And there's no economic theory which tells us that this is how much inequality a free market left to itself will produce. Now, voters, however, in a democracy can use redistributive taxation to flatten a pyramid. So, direct taxes essentially increase the price of labor. Negative direct taxes can increase the price of labor. Negative indirect taxes, so like negative sales taxes, can reduce the price of goods consumed by the lower income individuals and families. Now, why this particular form to reduce inequality? Because we still want the free market. We do not want to lose the virtues of accountability and incentives which a free market has. Of course, if you tax something, then the argument goes, oh, you're reducing the incentive to work by the people who you're putting a positive income tax on and all that. Yeah, whatever. I don't think it has a major impact. Okay, yeah, you can make an argument, but I don't think it's really important. I do not believe that you should have things like universal basic income, which basically hands out money to everybody. Those who are able to work should work, because people lose respect for themselves if they're receiving handouts. You want them to feel that they can be productive. So you want them to give the opportunity to be productive, and you want to give them a wage that is fair and that incentivizes them to work. Okay, now we can do a general equilibrium analysis, and I did write a paper, and I'm just going to talk about it a bit. It's quite technical. So you see, what happens with this, this inequality is that if you really want to analyze inequality in the tradition of equilibrium analysis, you cannot just have your inputs to production as labor and capital, because that assumes that all labor is the same. But we know that is not true. Managers and they have experienced a great increase in wealth, and especially if you look at the past 40 years, like starting from, like, let's say early 1980s, when you had these free trade agreements. What it did to a country like the US is that the free trade agreements increased competition for blue collar workers, because now they had to compete with blue collar workers from much poorer countries. And white collar workers, on the other hand, saw an increase in the demand for their services. And what the result was that you had the situation where white collar workers did much better than blue collar workers, and inequality in the economy increased, and to levels which I believe are like not good for the health of the society. So to analyze this systematically, and if you're going to kind of like say, okay, I want to figure out what is the optimal level of tax. If you want to answer that question, you have to, like, let's say, start systematically. So I wrote this paper where I had two kinds of workers. Like, look, labor was not homogeneous. There were two kinds of labor, white collar and blue collar. So I have a set of equations. I have a number of variables, and the number of variables has to equal the number of equations, and you can get to a solution. I'm not going to get into things like fixed point theorems to show that it has, like, it's a unique solution. Anyway, so the second part of the paper divided the US population into two parts, top 25 and the bottom 75, and I call the top 25 white collar and the bottom 75 blue collar. And the third and the final part of the paper gets to the issue of what is the optimum tax, and for that you need a social utility function. You need to know what exactly this model is going to, why you did this model, and why you wrote all these equations, because at some point you want to use that model for policy, and to do that you need something called a social utility function. Now, obviously the social utility function and this set of equations, they can't be analyzed analytically, they have to be maximized numerically. And also, you have to do a few calibrations to, you observe, okay, how much leisure is being consumed, for example, or what is the wealth level, and using those calibrations you can calculate some of the parameters in this model. Now, so that is the proper rigorous way to go about doing this, right? And you see the okay, I don't know. Without a social utility function, what is the meaning of this mathematical model if you don't have a social utility function? And the thing is that most of the time when people do these models, they do not do a social utility function, because that gets into normative issues, which I think they're afraid of, because when you say that, okay, this is what a social utility function should look like, then you're saying this group should be given this much weight and that group should be given that much weight, and that gets political. So they just try to avoid. They want to give a impression of being very scientific and above all that. So what they do is that they use GDP as a proxy for the social utility function. It's a stealth social utility function. Yeah, but GDP is a very bad social utility function because GDP ignores any distribution issues. It ignores all issues of inequality. And that is not going to work. Okay, you cannot get away from the normative issues when you want to decide policy. You can't have a policy that I'm just going to maximize GDP and I don't care how much inequality is being produced. That's not going to work. You're going to get like very angry, part of the electorate being very angry and wanting to throw out the incumbents and like bring in people like who make them promises or whatever. Okay. The other issue is that this cannot be solved analytically, obviously, but academics, they usually want like analytical solutions. They like math, they like mathematical solutions, but that's kind of, I don't think that's the way to go, because if you want to actually model the world, and it's not very, like you've not ignored like many issues, then you're going to get a model which cannot be solved analytically. It's like telling an aircraft designer that they cannot use numerical solutions to the Navier-Stokes equations and can only use analytical exact solutions. Okay. So if you're trying to design the best economy, you're trying to design the best fiscal policy, then yeah, use numerical solutions. The next level of improvement in economic systems after redistributive taxation is really job security. And this sort of goes to this, I have this economic system, which I also am going to describe in not this book, in my next book, The Nature Ternary. And that economic system is, I call it the ranch model. It's like everybody was given a ranch. And what are the features of a ranch? Well, the features of a ranch is that the people who used to have ranches, they were doing well. They would have a good life. They worked hard. They ran their ranches successfully. They did not have to worry about if they were like being treated badly by other people. They did their job. They produced their whatever they were producing. They got paid. Okay, and so if you had a ranch, you were born with a ranch, you're a lucky guy or a gal. Now, so in the ranch system of economics, or the ranch model of economics, is that the government actually creates a virtual sort of ranch, the conditions for everybody who's born to have a virtual sort of ranch. And that requires the government to give them job security. So if a person wants to work, they should be able to go to the government and work on the government job. Now, of course, the problem with government jobs, as we have found, is that they lack the sort of incentives and accountability which a free market produces. So, when the government provides work, there should be it should like still be less, the salaries should be less than what you would get in the free market, so that people are encouraged to move on to the free market, where there is incentive and accountability However, if somebody wants to just, doesn't care about getting the extra amount of money in the free market and just wants to continue working with the government, that's okay. As long as, so the challenge is to kind of make sure that the government jobs are actually productive. Just don't want to be in a situation where being in a government job means that you're just sitting there wasting your time. There is no intellectual challenge and stuff like that. Also, one way in which you can have more ranches, that is, you have more jobs which are intellectually challenging, which reward you for your work, is to prevent firms from becoming very large. You just put you can say that having smaller firms is a public good, and the way to encourage smaller firms is to tax them lighter. So larger firms or even give the smaller firms subsidies so that the larger firms have an incentive to break into smaller parts. Because really large firms are like the death of the soul. They're just like politics ridden, and they are just too much of managing your image, and the intellectual content is very low. There's too much politics and too little intellectual content. So when you break up larger firms into smaller firms, then they become more. They have to care. The smaller firms, firstly, smaller firms means that there's probably going to be more competition, so they have to worry about performance. And secondly, because the layers between the people taking the actions and the people doing the work, there are not so many layers. Okay, the more layers they are, the less insulated the people who make the decisions are from the actual performance, and politics becomes more and more important. So one way in which you can produce more of good jobs is to have smaller firms, and to give incentives for larger firms, economic incentives for larger firms to break up into smaller firms. Okay, and then at the highest level of economic system is the realization that we are actually trying to provide people an environment where they can live their best possible lives. Okay, so we are trying to provide an environment where people have the are in a situation, and now the thing is that if you follow the way economists think, and it is that more productivity is always good, right? So like productivity is supposed to be great, but that is not true. We have to first develop an understanding of the ourselves, and then I think I have a section called the scientific model for human behavior, mental health and happiness. I think that's what the name of the section is. Anyway, in that section I basically cover what is it that gives us a good life. And there you realize when human nature, you have to understand human nature, and like just this like frivolous assumption that the more you consume, the happier you are. has led to a lot of trouble and it does not work. So there, the the human nature is understood as something that has been produced by evolution. So to understand human nature, we need to understand evolution. And of course, just by understanding evolution, you can't totally say this is human nature. Then you also have to have observations. Okay, so your observations of humans plus evolution gives you human nature. Evolution is like it produces the skeleton for human nature, and your observations adds flesh to it. Now, if so when you have this understanding of human nature, what you also realize, and there, the argument goes that human nature, what we are really seeking is love, and I call it love, which can be like satisfaction, pleasure, happiness, enjoyment, whatever. It's a reward from the brain given to us for things the brain considers important, for having done the things the brain considers important. Love, that's one word, okay, which covers a variety of rewards which the brain gives us. That's what we seek. So we seek love, and the point is that doing work which is satisfying, which we feel that we have done our duty, that we have taken care of the people we love and care for, and which requires us to expend our energy, this work is a source of love. If all of our work was replaced by robos, that love would be gone. Okay? So this is essentially an understanding of the fact that more and more mechanization and more automation, which requires us to do less and less labor, is not the way to go. It's a dead end. It's going to lead to failure. It's going to lead to people who are weak. What we need is for people to be given work which they have to do so that they can become small, so that they can become confident, strong individuals.